Hiroshima child. I come and stand at every door, but none can hear my silent tread. I knock, and yet remain unseen, for I am dead, for I am dead. I'm only 7, though I died in Hiroshima long ago. I'm 7 now as I was then. When children die, they do not grow. My hair was scorched by swirling flame, my eyes grew dim, my eyes grew blind. Death came and turned my bones to dust, and that was scattered by the wind. I need no fruit, I need no rice, I need no sweets, not even bread. I ask for nothing for myself, for I am dead. For I am dead. All that I need is that for peace you fight today, so that the children of this world can live and grow and laugh and play.
Frida Berrigan is one of those rare treasures, a second-generation peace activist, born and raised in Jonah House, which is a resistance community in Baltimore. Her parents, Elizabeth McAllister and Phil Berrigan, had been involved in struggling against the perils of nuclear weaponry and all of the militarism of this country for several generations now. Frida is currently the Senior Program Associate at New America Foundation's the Arms and Security Initiative in New York City. She's been there for almost 10 years doing this type of work. It is a think tank that does work on domestic and foreign policy from a common sense progressive perspective. Today she'll be talking to us about the nuclear dangers today, 63 years after Nagasaki. Frida Berrigan.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for coming. And thank you so much for holding this day sort of separate and different from other days, right? That this isn't just a day like any other day. It's a day to be held up. It's a day to come together. It's a day to remember. And it's also nice to be somewhere where it's nice and cold. I got here last night and I was like, oh my God, it's freezing here. August in Broome County seems like a nice thing. So 63 years ago this week, the United States was the first and so far the last nation to use nuclear weapons in war. And we know that tens of thousands of people were killed in a single instant. And then over the course of the rest of 1945, another 200,000 or so people succumbed to radiation-related ailments and other diseases. And I was reading recently, I want to share with you a quote from Admiral William Leahy, who wrote a book called I Was There, about his experiences during World War II. And he reflected in this book, being the first to use nuclear weapons, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages, These new concepts of total war are basically distasteful to soldiers and sailors of my generation. And he continues saying, employment of the atomic bomb in war will take us back to the cruelty towards non-combatants of the days of Genghis Khan. So this is a reflection from somebody who saw the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki firsthand. And so here we are, 63 years later, 63 years into the nuclear age. And this anniversary provides an opportunity to remember and to commemorate, to delve again into history, but to also look at where we are right now. What are the nuclear issues that face us today? And so I want to start by just doing a little assessment of a really bleak picture for us today in terms of nuclear dangers. It's not just something that happened 63 years ago. It's not something that ended when the Berlin Wall fell down in 1991. It's dangers that continue to haunt us today. And so just to list them, we have stalled disarmament, we have irresponsible engagement on the part of the United States from new and nascent nuclear powers. We face the danger of nuclear terrorism, and we're also seeing ground being gained by the proponents of nuclear power, right? And then there are the billions that are being pumped into the U.S. nuclear weapons complex. So that's like, that's a pretty hefty chunk of bad news that we face today, 63 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I just want to look at each one in turn, because I think that, there was a time when the American people were very concerned about nuclear weapons, right? People thought about it, people hid under desks, there were drills, there were practicing surviving a nuclear attack. And since the end of the Cold War, we haven't done that so much anymore, and nuclear weapons as an issue, as a problem, as a threat, as an existential threat, have sort of receded from the American consciousness, and yet it remains we remain in a very precarious situation today. So I want to just spend a couple minutes with each of these. So stalled disarmament, right? We know that between Russia and the United States, and then France and the UK and China, there are about 27,000 nuclear warheads that exist in the world today. And most of those are held by the United States and Russia, the sort of the remnant of the Soviet Union. And in 2002, President Bush and President Putin sat down. They met in Crawford, Texas, and they decided to do some disarmament, right? They decided to scale down nuclear stockpiles, and they agreed over the next 10 years, between 2002 and 2012, to cut nuclear stockpiles by 2/3. And that was a pretty radical. Well, radical. It was a good move, right? Cut nuclear stockpiles by 2/3. And there was a lot of criticism at the time of the agreement, but it was sort of basically a good step, right? And now here we are in 2008, halfway through that period when we were going to be cutting our nuclear stockpiles by 2/3, and we really haven't. We're not halfway there. We're not even a third of the way there. That key post-Cold War priority has faltered, it's sort of a dead in the water. And this is sort of a good opportunity, too, to talk about what is a nuclear warhead, right? We see the pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We have this sense of the destructive power of nuclear weapons, that tens of thousands of people can die in an instant, that a city can be destroyed. But the weapons that we have today, these 27,000 warheads that are in the world, each one is many times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Fat Man was a 15-kiloton weapon, and now most of the warheads that we have are 150 to 250 kilotons, and there are some megaton weapons, so 10 times, 20 times more powerful than those weapons that were used. So while not living up to the promise of disarmament and this most recent promise that we heard in 2002, which was just the latest of many promises, the United States is being irresponsible and inconsistent throughout the world, supporting some states that possess nuclear weapons while supporting some countries that have nuclear weapons outside of international treaties while punishing others. And we can see this very clearly in our posture towards India on the one hand and to Iran on the other hand. But in order to understand this sort of inconsistent policy, we need to understand a little bit more about the network of arms treaties that are supposed to be regulating global project for disarmament, right? And I just want to touch briefly on the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I like to think of as the No Promises Treaty, because it has been pretty effectively undermined in the last number of years. So the NPT came into force in 1970, and it established a framework under which the nuclear weapon states committed to disarmament. And those countries that did not have nuclear weapons signed on to the treaty as well, and their signature was a pledge not to develop nuclear weapons. And there was a sort of a balance or an agreement that was struck between the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots. We will disarm. The rest of the countries of the world will not arm, and we will give we will give nuclear power technology to those countries in exchange for them opting out of joining the nuclear club. Right? So it's this sort of bargain that was set. 181 nations signed on to the NPT. And I just want to read sort of the core of this treaty, which states, each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty for general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. So as far as treaties go, it's pretty rock solid, right? It's pretty unequivocal. There aren't a lot of loopholes in words like strict and general and effective at an early date, right? These are all sort of good treaty words, right? And so we have this promise to general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international controls. And it's been repeatedly undermined, negated, broken. And I think it's certainly been broken by other countries besides the United States, right? That each country that has nuclear weapons has its own relationship to the treaty and has, sought to not abide by it. But we live in the United States, and so let's look just at the way the United States has found the wiggle room, right? In general and complete disarmament, found the wiggle room in that. And it's interesting to look at some of the statements from the Defense Department and both the Clinton and the Bush administrations since the end of the Cold War, when you would think, oh, if we're going to disarm, this is the time to do it. So in 1999, Clinton's national security strategy said this: the United States must continue to maintain a robust triad of strategic forces sufficient to deter any hostile foreign leadership with access to nuclear forces, and to convince it that seeking a nuclear advantage would be futile. Right? So we will maintain a robust triad of strategic forces, strategics are standing in for nuclear. And then in 2002, we heard sort of the Bush version of that in his nuclear posture review, and he said, or the administration said, nuclear weapons, quote, provide credible capabilities to deter a wide range of threats, including weapons of mass destruction and large-scale conventional military force. So we are beginning to see nuclear weapons sort of framed as an anti-terror, a counter-terror strategy, right? And then in 2006, we get the Quadrennial Defense Review from the Pentagon, and it envisions a role for nuclear weapons, and it states more clearly this role in the war on terror, right? These weapons with this extraordinary destructive power have a role in the war on terror. And the QDR says, what advocates for a shift from a one-size-fits-all deterrence to a tailored deterrence from rogue powers, terrorist networks, and near-peer competitors. And so in the past we had just really big bombs, and now we're going to have little bombs, medium-sized bombs, big bombs, and super big bombs, all with nuclear capabilities. So we see that NPT effectively abrogated, right? And abrogated by the big powers is lack of movement towards disarmament, towards the abolition of nuclear weapons. And so in the absence of like a strong treaty, a treaty that's being held and worked on, other countries have developed nuclear weapons. And they've done so outside of the treaty, right? So Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, and India have all arrived on the international stage with nuclear weapons, with nuclear capabilities, and done that outside of the NPT, obviously. And Iran, which is a signature to the treaty, is suspected of pursuing nuclear weapons and is certainly pursuing nuclear technology. And then we hear from the International Atomic Energy Agency that in the next 10 years, 20 to 30 new nuclear powers could arrive on the stage. Right? And so we have a new paradigm of sort of every nation for itself nuclear weapons, right? So, and just a couple nations on that list from the IAEA, Turkey has the intent and the capability, Egypt, Brazil, South Africa, and the list goes on and on, right? These are countries who could decide, and if they decided, could within 5 years have a nuclear weapon. So this is a very grave threat that we faced here. So, I keep looking at the time. I always it's like the first half of the talk always takes like 3 times as long as the second half, as I end up going through things very, very fast. But just a brief note on India and Iran, right? So now, right now, the United States and India are in the final stages of this nuclear deal, right? And it's seen by many critics, and I certainly agree with this, as giving India a special path to nuclear legitimacy, despite its development of nuclear weapons and its threat of use of nuclear weapons and its testing of nuclear weapons completely outside of international law. So India is close to accepting a deal which would give it access to nuclear fuel and technology for nuclear power plants in exchange for opening its nuclear weapons programs to international inspection. Excuse me, and it also, it sort of opens up Indian markets and the commercial market for all sorts of U.S. goods. And India was sort of traditionally aligned with the Soviet Union and sort of looked to Russia for a long time. And so this is sort of hey, India, pay attention to us, buy things from us, and we'll be fine with the fact that you have nuclear weapons. In early June, President Bush said this deal was important for our respective countries, and he's very eager to sort of cross this off the list before he leaves office in January. This deal is very important. So while supporting India's nuclear program, we are simultaneously threatening Iran with attack for more or less for thinking nuclear thoughts, right? We know, and I'm sure this group knows, that the National Intelligence Assessment said that Tehran had ceased to pursue nuclear weapons in 2003. And while they certainly have continued with uranium enrichment and they've tested long-range missiles, they don't have anything. They don't have a bomb to put on those missiles. And they couldn't have one within 5 years. So we're in this like very delicate period, and instead of treating it as a delicate period, we're sort of continuing with this all options are on the table kind of rhetoric. And we all know that that is code for we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons to destroy your nascent nuclear capabilities, right? And then we hear John McCain, and I watched this clip a number of times on YouTube, singing well, I won't sing, it's too early in the morning, but, singing Bomb, 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 Iran, using the tune of this Beach Boys song. And this is the man who's running on foreign policy experience, on his gravitas, his military know-how, and here he is sort of bomb, 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 Iran, and sort of thinking that this is funny, right? So we have this very striking contrast between how we're relating to India on the one hand and Iran on the other hand. And I think it's instructive, India has things that we want, and Iran has things that we don't want other countries to have, right? Their oil. We can talk more about Iran and India if you all want. Turning briefly to nuclear terrorism, this is one of those, right? So nuclear terrorism is a real threat, right? The foreign policy community very concerned about the possibility of non-state actors getting their hands either on a nuclear device or on nuclear material, and then with explosives, having a crude nuclear event, which probably wouldn't kill a lot of people, but would certainly, draw the United States to a standstill. And so this is something that is keeping people up at night, right? Nuclear expert Graham Allison calls nuclear terrorism the ultimate preventable catastrophe, right? Because we know where the warheads are, and we know where the nuclear material is, and we just need to sort of secure it and dismantle warheads that are lying around in the Ukraine and other former Soviet states, and we need to secure stockpiles of uranium and plutonium. And this is where this specter of 20 to 30 new nuclear states becomes a large concern, right? And I've been trying to pay attention to this nuclear terrorism thing, and there's a program, the Nunn-Lugar program, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which is funded at about $1 billion a year, and is doing amazing work in former Soviet states, securing stockpiles of nuclear weapons, providing new employment for nuclear scientists from the Soviet Union. And it's the kind of thing that should be funded 3 or 4 times as much to really do this very quickly. And so I try and pay attention to this and try and sort of wrap my mind around nuclear terrorism. But I'm always sort of struck by the fact that we've been living in an age of nuclear terror, without a crude nuclear device being detonated by Al Qaeda or other terrorists, and that nuclear weapons don't need to be detonated in order to destroy, right? And so while I'm aware of this grave threat from nuclear terrorism, my colleague at the New America Foundation did this study. In 2 years' time, a group of well-motivated, highly motivated people with less than $10 million could buy nuclear material and could deploy and detonate a device. I mean, it is a threat, right? But there's also sort of this larger threat. But anyway, so nuclear terrorism is a problem. So even as the threat of nuclear terrorism looms, nuclear power plants, right, which would be a relatively easy target for a terrorist attack, are making a comeback. And I think we have all sort of seen this in our newspapers, that the nuclear energy industry is taking advantage of $4 gasoline and the burgeoning energy crisis, and they're trying to give nuclear power a makeover. And so I was reading this article in the Wall Street Journal that really we don't need to, nuclear energy doesn't need to be cleaner or safer. It just needs to not have the word nuclear in it anymore. And so this one guy is calling it terrestrial energy. And I thought I really like that. I mean, it's very smart kind of thing. So if somebody wants to build a terrestrial energy plant in your community, just say no, because they are not going to be burning dirt, right? And that's kind of what it sounds like. But both presidential candidates are kind of into nuclear power, right? McCain has called for very actively, he's really into it, 45 new nuclear power plants in the United States by 2030 is sort of what he wants. And he's calling it the cleanest, safest, most reliable energy source on the planet. And Obama is a little bit more circumspect. He, when asked directly about nuclear energy, he listed he cataloged a long list of problems with nuclear energy, environmental, blah, 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 and said if all those can be solved, I'm on board, right? So, so it's kind of one of these, it's not flip-flopping, right? But it's definitely sort of, he's on both sides of things, right? But each new nuclear power plant, $2.5 billion for each one. And the nuclear energy industry doesn't like to talk about the cost at all, right? It's been, subsidized through and through at every step along the way. But I was struck by this comment from an analyst at Greenpeace who said, $2.5 billion, very expensive way to boil water. And that investing $1 in renewable technologies and increasing energy efficiencies does 7 to 10 times more work. That dollar works 7 to 10 times harder than a dollar invested into nuclear power. So moving on our catalog, but they're really primed, and there are a number of what are they called? Sorry, like licenses. The nuclear energy industry has gotten a number of licenses for new power plants, I think mostly in the southern part of the United States, but there are 6 or 7 licenses that are out there right now, and primed for many more. So we have all of these nuclear concerns, and then we have these actually really powerful and right-on calls for nuclear disarmament coming from this very unlikely cadre of people, right? So Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, William Perry, George Shultz, right? All ardent Cold Warriors, wrote this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last January calling for the United States to take leadership in the world for nuclear disarmament. But the Bush administration has ignored even these calls from these elder statesmen, and has really pushed, sort of using the fog of the war on terror, right, has really pushed nuclear weapons development forward in a profound and surprising way, a way that hasn't garnered a lot of attention. And right now, the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration has this plan for complex transformation, is what they're calling it, complex transformation. There are 8 major nuclear sites around the country, and the DOE would like to invest up to $150 billion into these 8 nuclear sites, and really ramp them up for a new century of nuclearism. This new spending is aimed at developing a new generation of nuclear weapons, part of this tailored kind of deterrence that the Quadrennial Defense Review was talking about, and a more responsive production network. Some people are very concerned that because we haven't been able to test nuclear weapons since, early in the Clinton administration? Mid-1980s, I can't remember right now. We haven't tested nuclear weapons in a long time. They're wearing out, and scientists don't know how to work with them anymore. And we need to do all this new spending to keep the scientists interested, keep their minds working, in case we need new nuclear weapons. Right? The fact that we have 10,000 or more than 2,000 of which are on hair trigger alert, kind of doesn't factor into this equation. So anyway, so complex transformation. And we've also seen a significant and again, very quiet increase in nuclear spending under the Bush administration. Adjusted for inflation, we've seen almost a 15% increase from 2001 to today. I was like, well, those, yeah, but we're still not spending as much as during the Cold War, right? No, we're spending 1/3 more today than we were at the height of the Cold War on nuclear weapons. So for all of these reasons and many more, in January of 2007, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which keeps this doomsday clock, moved the hands of the clock from 7 minutes, I guess 7 minutes, 7 minutes to 5 minutes to nuclear midnight. And I, grew up with the doomsday clock. It was the reason I couldn't go to the movies. 3 minutes to nuclear midnight, not going to the movies. So this movement from 7 to 5, all these years after the end of the Cold War, is very significant. So I just, I guess I want to conclude by saying, we have a lot of work to do, right? To keep in mind, what's happened in the past, and also keep our eye on the ball in terms of what's happening today. And there's been some glimmers of good news, right? Congress cut funding from some studies around reliable replacement warheads. And we have some daylight in the negotiations with North Korea, and they did this very symbolic, but kind of significant symbolism of blowing up one of their nuclear water cooling towers in June. And then there is these four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Kissinger et al., who are making this very solid call for nuclear disarmament. So we kind of try and find some of the good news, right? You could criticize significantly each one of those little pieces of good news, but let's just hold them as good news right now. Each one of them is sort of like a small, sputtering little flame, right? That's still burning and needs to be augmented and increased. And I think too that the work that this community is doing, that everybody who sort of is holding this day apart from other days, is doing, is also sort of part of these little flames. And on the theme of flame, I want to end with this story from Hiroshima, and I read about it a couple days ago in AFP, and so this is the story. Yatsudo Yamamoto, Tatsuyo Yamamoto was a Japanese soldier during World War II. And on August 6, 1945, he was commuting to a military base near Hiroshima. And he survived the blast. And there he was in Hiroshima, and he said, oh my God, my uncle lives in Hiroshima, and he has a bookshop there. All of this devastation, I have to go find him. And so he goes to where the uncle's bookshop was, and on a normal day, he would have been there at that time of day, and it's destroyed, right? And he can't find his uncle anywhere. And the bookstore is on fire. And so Tatsuyo takes like a little portable heater that I guess would be common in Japanese shops and homes for when it got cold, sort of like a brazier. And he takes this little brazier that's there, and he lights the charcoal from the flame of his uncle's burning shop. And he takes it home to his village, and about 100 miles from Hiroshima. And for the next 23 years, this military veteran keeps this little flame burning. He doesn't make a big deal of it, but there's always like a little heater with a burning flame in it. And he, nobody outside of his family really knows how important this is to him. When he has to go out of town, it's somebody's responsibility to keep that flame going. And then 23 years later, his story and the story that this flame, this Hiroshima flame, has continued to burn for 23 years, gets out, and the Japanese government builds a little park in his village and builds endless flame in this little park. And then in 14 other places around Japan, they build these parks, and a flame is lit from his original flame in each one of these parks. In 1988, the flame comes to the United States, obviously before all of these, if you can't bring lotion on an airplane, you're definitely not bringing a little brazier of Hiroshima flames, right? But so 1998, the UN Conference on Disarmament, the flame comes to the United States and it travels all over the country. And so more and more people now around Japan and also around the world are keeping this flame burning. And Tatsuya Yamato died soon after the war in Iraq started. And he was furious that Japanese soldiers went to Iraq as part of the coalition of the willing. And he died saying, "It's time to end this foolish practice of killing one another." And the flame kept burning. And his son is a Buddhist monk and a ceramicist. His name, just because I really like pronouncing words that I can't pronounce. His son's name is Yakudo Yamato, and he keeps the father's flame burning in the village where his father lived and died. And I just thought that was such a beautiful story, such a small thing to do, and yet to do it, for the last 63 years is quite significant and powerful.
August 9th was the day that a man by the name of Franz Jägenstätter, a German, a Catholic, a Christian, said that many months before that he would not serve in the German army. He was an Austrian, and during the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the Nazis, of course, had full control of Austria, and most complied. He said he did not believe in killing another human being. 1943, when they called him up, he said he would not do it. He believed in the nonviolence of Christ. But remember this, that Austria was basically Christian. They were Catholic. German was Catholic and Lutheran. They were Christian. And there was full support, pretty much. Very few individuals stood up to the right. Franz Jägenstätter did. And he did it against, his family asked him not to do it. His pastor of his church, the bishop would not support him. They said, you must follow orders. You're render to Caesar. And he said he will not render to Caesar the killing of another human being. He was executed in Berlin in 1943 on this date, Franz Jägenstätter. Anyone else with any comment to make about Nagasaki, Hiroshima? Just one last thing then, since I have the microphone. Christians were baptized Christians who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It was baptized Christians who dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. And Nagasaki was the only major Christian city in all of Japan. It had been converted to Christianity by Jesuits in the 16th century, 16th and 17th centuries. The day that they were going to Nagasaki, the American bomb crew were actually supposed to be on the way to Nagoya. They were detoured because it was a day cloudier than today over Nagoya. They couldn't find a ground zero target. So they were transferred then to go to Nagasaki. And the bombardier gave the word that he saw a break in the clouds in Nagasaki. And they knew they touched ground zero when they saw the spire with the cross on it, the Catholic Cathedral of Nagasaki. And that became ground zero. That was 63 years ago today. Let's remember.